The monotonous sound of the scanner echoed down the supermarket aisle as Zephyra went through item after item. Her nimble fingers danced over the cashier's keyboard, a mechanical ballet she had perfected over the years. Today, however, something seemed different. An uncomfortable feeling hung in the air, like a heavy cloud about to collapse. "Next, please," she called out, forcing a smile at the next customer. As she worked, Zephyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her dark brown eyes, normally alert and bright, were clouded with worry. She glanced at the clock on the wall, counting down the minutes until the end of business. Finally, as the last customer left and the supermarket lights began to fade, Zephyra took a deep breath. It was time to count the till. With trembling fingers, she opened the drawer and began to count the notes and coins. Once, twice, 3 times, she counted again, her heart racing each time. There was no doubt. The cashier had less money than she should have. Much less. "It can't be," she muttered to herself, running her hand through her curly hair, a nervous gesture she had made since she was a child. Zephyra looked around, as if the answers could be written on the empty shelves or in the silent aisles. The supermarket, normally a place of movement and life, seemed eerily quiet now. With trembling hands, she picked up the previous day's bills. Perhaps there was a simple explanation, a miscalculation that she could correct. But the more she examined the figures, the more the discrepancy became apparent. "Hey, Zeph, still here?" The familiar voice of Callista, her colleague from the night shift, snapped her out of her thoughts. Zephyra looked up, meeting her friend's concerned gaze. "Cal, do you have a minute?" Zephyra asked, her voice lower than usual. Callista approached, her expression changing from curiosity to concern when she saw Zephyra's tense face. "Of course. What is it?" Zephyra hesitated for a moment, biting her lower lip. Have you noticed anything strange about the cashiers lately?" Callista frowned thoughtfully. "Not that I can remember. Why? Has something happened?" Zephyra looked around once more, making sure they were alone before whispering. "The cashier has less money than she should. A lot less." Callista's eyes widened. "Are you sure? Did you check everything?" Zephyra nodded, feeling the weight of the situation fall on her shoulders. 3 times. And yesterday's accounts don't add up either." Callista leaned on the counter, her face reflecting Zephyra's concern. "This is serious, Zeph. You know how Mr. Thorne is about these things." The new manager's name loomed between them like an ominous shadow. Mr. Thorne, with his eagle eyes and zero-tolerance policy, was feared by all employees. "I know," Zephyra sighed, feeling her stomach turn. "But I can't believe it's my mistake. I'm careful. You know that." Callista put a comforting hand on Zephyra's shoulder. "I know you are. But these times haven't been easy for anyone. The bills keep coming, the prices keep rising." Zephyra nodded, remembering her own financial difficulties. The rent arrears, the electricity bills piling up. It was a constant struggle to keep her head above water. "Do you think someone might be—" Zephyra couldn't finish the sentence. The idea was too painful to verbalize. Callista looked around nervously before replying in a low voice. "It wouldn't be the first time something like this has happened. Remember Jake from the electronics department?" Zephyra remembered. Jake had been caught embezzling goods and was fired on the spot. Mr. Thorne made a point of using the incident as an example for all the employees. "But who?" Zephyra asked, more to herself than to Callista. "I don't know, Zeph. But whoever it was, they must be desperate. With this new manager breathing down our necks, no one would risk their job like that without good reason." Callista's words hung heavy in the air. Zephyra knew she was right. The fear of losing one's job was a constant in everyone's life. With the job market becoming increasingly difficult, Every vacancy was fought for tooth and nail. "What are you going to do?" Callista asked, breaking the tense silence that had settled in. Zephyra took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. "I don't know yet. I need to think about it. Maybe I should check the security recordings first." Callista nodded sympathetically. "Good idea, but be careful, Zeph. You know how quickly things can get complicated around here." Zephyra forced a smile, grateful for her friend's concern. "I know. Thanks, Cal." As Callista walked away to finish her chores, Zephyra stood there, staring at the open till, her mind full of unanswered questions. Who could be behind this? And more importantly, what was she supposed to do? The distant sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, startling Zephyra. For a moment she imagined Mr. Thorne appearing, his cold eyes fixed on her, demanding explanations. But it was only the night security guard doing his rounds. Zephyra closed the till with a heavy sigh. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would investigate the recordings and try to find out what was going on. But for now, she needed to go home and try to get some rest, even though she knew that sleep probably wouldn't come easily tonight. As she walked to the back exit, Zephyra couldn't help but notice how the shadows seemed darker tonight, as if the supermarket itself held secrets that she wasn't yet ready to discover. The cool night air welcomed her as she stepped outside, bringing with it the smell of impending rain. Zephyra raised her eyes to the cloudy sky, feeling the first drops fall on her face. It was as if the universe was in tune with her inner restlessness. As she walked to the bus stop, Zephyra couldn't help but think of all the familiar faces in the supermarket. People she had worked side by side with for years, people she considered friends. The idea that one of them could be involved in something so serious was painful. The bus arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Zephyra climbed on, finding an empty seat at the back. As the vehicle moved through the sleepy city, she leaned her head on the cold glass, watching the raindrops slide down, forming complex patterns. Tomorrow, she thought again. Tomorrow she would begin to unravel this mystery. But for now, all she could do was wait, with a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts, as the bus took her home through the rainy night. The day dawned gray, as if the sky reflected the restlessness that tormented Zephyra. She arrived at the supermarket earlier than usual, her footsteps echoing through the still empty aisles. The air was filled with anticipation and apprehension. Zephyra headed straight for the security room, her heart pounding hard against her chest. She knew that what she was about to do could change everything. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock, turning it slowly. The room was small and stuffy, dominated by a wall of silently flashing monitors. Zephyra sat in front of them, her eyes scanning the black and white images. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, before starting to review the previous day's recordings. The hours passed slowly as she observed the constant flow of customers and employees. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. But then something caught her eye. A subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Zephyra leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. It was Finian, her longtime friend. She watched him approach one of the cashiers for a quiet moment, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. Zephyra's heart sank. "No, Finn," she whispered, incredulity tinging her voice. "What are you doing?" The images continued to unfold before her, showing Finian repeating the process on other boxes. Each time he did this, Zephyra felt as if a piece of her heart would break off. She paused the recording, slumping back in her chair. Her hands were shaking, and she could taste the bitterness of betrayal in her mouth. Finian, her friend, her confidant. How could he do this? The sound of the door opening startled her. Zephyra turned quickly, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Mr. Thorne, his cold eyes sweeping the room before settling on her. "Miss Zephyra," he said, his voice as sharp as ice. "I didn't realize we'd scheduled a meeting so early." Zephyra stood up hastily, her face burning with shame and fear. "Mr. Thorne, I was just checking the security recordings without authorization," he added, arching an eyebrow. Zephyra swallowed, feeling the weight of his gaze. "I noticed some discrepancies in the cashiers last night," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I should investigate before taking the matter any further." Mr. Thorne studied her for a long moment, his face an impenetrable mask. "And what did you find out?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded with implications. Zephyra hesitated, her loyalty to Finian fighting against her sense of duty. "I'm still investigating," she finally replied, looking away. Mr. Thorne stepped forward, invading her personal space. "Ms. Zephyra, I hope you understand the gravity of the situation. If there is something going on in this supermarket, I need to know immediately." Zephyra nodded, feeling small under his penetrating gaze. "I understand, sir. I promise that as soon as I know something for sure, you'll be the first to know." Mr. Thorne watched her for a moment longer before giving a brief nod. "I'll see you on your shift, Ms. Zephyra. And remember, I'm watching you." With that, he turned and left, leaving Zephyra trembling in his wake. She leaned on the table, her legs feeling weak. The meeting with Mr. Thorne had only intensified her anxiety. Zephyra left the security room, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She walked through the aisles of the supermarket, which was now beginning to come alive with the arrival of the first customers and employees. Her eyes scanned her surroundings, landing on familiar faces. Every smile, every nod now seemed to carry new meanings. Who else could be hiding secrets? Who else could be silently struggling with difficulties she didn't know about? When she reached her till, Zephyra saw Finian on the other side of the aisle, organizing a shelf. He looked up and smiled at her, waving happily. His smile, once so comforting, now looked like a mask, hiding painful truths. Zephyra forced a smile in response, feeling the weight of the secret she now carried. How could she face the day, knowing what she knew? How could she look Finian in the eye and pretend that everything was fine? As the first customers began to arrive, Zephyra concentrated on her work, trying to keep her turbulent thoughts at bay. But every time the scanner beeped, every time the cashier's drawer opened, she couldn't help thinking about what she had witnessed on the recordings. The hours dragged on, and Zephyra felt Mr. Thorne's gaze on her constantly. She could feel his suspicion, almost tangible in the air between them. Every time he passed her box, she felt a shiver run down her spine. During her break, Zephyra took refuge in the staff room, seeking a moment of peace. But even there, she couldn't escape the tension that consumed her. Her eyes fixed on a picture on the wall, an image of all the smiling employees at a company picnic. Finian was there, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. "Hey, Zeph, what's up?" Callista's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Zephyra turned around, meeting her friend's worried gaze. "Yeah, just tired," she replied, forcing a smile. Callista sat down next to her, her eyes studying Zephyra's face. "You look more than tired. Has something happened?" Zephyra hesitated, the weight of the secret pressing down on her chest. Part of her wanted to tell Callista everything, to share the burden she was carrying. But she knew she couldn't. Not yet. "Just a bad night's sleep," she lied, hating herself for it. "Nothing to worry about." Callista didn't look convinced, but before she could press any further, the door opened and Finian walked in, his bright smile lighting up the room. "Hello, ladies," he greeted cheerfully. "What are those faces? Looks like someone died." Zephyra felt her stomach twist. How could he act so normally? How could he smile and joke as if nothing was wrong? "Just the usual tiredness, Finn," Callista replied, casting another worried glance at Zephyra. Finian approached, placing a hand on Zephyra's shoulder. "Hey, Zeph, are you all right? You look pale." His touch, once comforting, now made her want to pull away. Zephyra stood up abruptly, almost knocking over her chair. "I'm fine," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I just need to get back to work." She hurried out of the room, feeling Finian and Callista's confused gazes on her back. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm herself down. The rest of the day passed in a blur of transactions and forced smiles. Zephyra felt like an actress on a stage, playing the part of herself but feeling completely disconnected. When it was finally time to close the till, Zephyra did so mechanically, her fingers moving on their own. She barely registered the numbers, her mind still caught up in the images she had seen in the morning. As she walked to the exit, she saw Finian saying goodbye to some colleagues. For a moment, their gazes met, and Zephyra saw something. Guilt, fear, flashed across his face. But it was as quick as she could have imagined. Outside, the night was clear and starry, a cruel contrast to the storm roaring inside. Zephyra looked up at the sky, searching for answers in the distant stars. But they remained silent, indifferent to the dramas unfolding below. As she walked to the bus stop, Zephyra knew that a decision had to be made. She couldn't carry this secret around forever. But what should she do? Confront Finian? Tell Mr. Thorne? The consequences of any choice seemed devastating. The bus arrived, its lights cutting through the darkness. Zephyra climbed on, finding an empty seat. As the vehicle moved through the sleepy city, she closed her eyes, letting the tears she had been holding back all day finally fall. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would confront Finian. For better or worse, she needed answers. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fix this without destroying everything in the process. With this resolution in mind, Zephyra allowed herself a moment of hope. But as the bus took her home through the night, she couldn't help feeling that, whatever happened, nothing would ever be the same again. Dawn came with a silent promise of change. Zephyra watched the first rays of sunlight paint the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, feeling the weight of the decision she had made. Today was the day. Today she would confront Finian. The walk to the cafe where they had agreed to meet seemed endless. Each step echoed in her ears like the ticking of a relentless clock, marking the seconds until the inevitable confrontation. The doorbell tinkled softly as Zephyra entered the cafe. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and fresh bread would normally calm her down, but today it only intensified her nausea. Her eyes scanned the room until they found Finian, sitting in a far corner, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as if seeking warmth. "Hey, Zeph!" Finian smiled when he saw her, but there was a tension in his eyes that betrayed his apparent casualness. "I thought it was strange that you wanted to meet up outside of work. Is everything all right?" Zephyra sat down, feeling as if every movement was made in slow motion. She looked at Finian, her friend of so many years, and felt a sharp pang of pain in her chest. How had it come to this? "Finn," she began, her voice low and trembling. "We need to talk about something serious." Finian's smile faltered, a shadow of concern crossing his face. "What's wrong, Zeph? You're scaring me." Zephyra took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she could. "I've seen the security recordings, Finn. I know what you did." The words hung between them like a heavy cloud. Finian paled, his eyes widening in shock and then in understanding. For a moment it looked like he was going to deny it, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. Zeph, he began, his voice breaking. I don't know what to say. Why, Finn? Zephyra asked, the pain in her voice palpable. Why would you do that? I thought we were friends. Finian ran his hands over his face, seeming to age years in seconds. We are friends, Zeph. That's why it's so hard. Difficult, Zephyra repeated, a touch of anger coloring her voice. Hard is seeing your best friend betray your trust, Finn. Hard is carrying that secret, knowing that at any moment, everything could fall apart. Tears began to form in Finian's eyes. You don't understand, Zeph. I had no choice. There's always a choice, Finn, Zephyra retorted, but her voice softened when she saw the anguish on his face. What happened? Why did you have to do this? Finian looked around nervously before leaning closer. It's my mother, Zeph. She's ill. The insurance won't cover the treatment and the bills. They just keep coming. I've tried everything, but... Her voice faltered, and Zephyra felt her anger dissipate, replaced by a wave of compassion. She knew Finian's mother, a sweet woman who had always treated her like a daughter. The thought of her being ill was painful. Why didn't you tell me? Zephyra asked softly. I could have helped. Finian shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. How, Zeph? You can barely pay your own rent. I couldn't ask you to. Silence fell between them, heavy with the unspoken truths and difficult choices that had led to this moment. Zephyra looked at her friend, seeing not a criminal but a desperate man trying to save someone he loved. How much? She finally asked. How much did you take? Finian hesitated before answering in a whisper. Almost 3,000. I know it's a lot, but I promised Zeph I'll return every penny. I just need time. Zephyra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the situation. $3,000. It was more than she'd earned in 2 months. The gravity of what Finian had done hit her full force. Finn, you know this is serious, don't you? If Mr. Thorne finds out... I know, Finian interrupted, fear evident in his voice. Believe me, Zeph, I know. But I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't let my mother die. The tears Finian had been holding back finally began to fall. Zephyra felt her own heart break at the sight of her friend's suffering. She reached out, covering his hand with her own, We'll sort this out, Finn, she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. I don't know how yet, but we'll find a way. Finian looked at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. You're not going to turn me in? Zephyra hesitated. Part of her knew that the right thing to do would be to report the incident, to follow the rules. But another part, the part that had known Finian for years, that knew how much he loved his mother, couldn't do that. No, she finally said. But Finn, this has to stop. Now. Not a penny more, understand? Finian nodded vigorously. I promise, Zeph. Never again. I'll find another way. We'll find another way, Zephyra corrected. You're not alone in this, Finn. Not anymore. The relief on Finian's face was palpable, but Zephyra could see that there was still fear in his eyes, fear of the future, fear of the consequences that could still come. What do we do now? Finian asked, his voice small and uncertain. Zephyra took a deep breath, her mind working furiously. First, we need a plan to return the money without arousing suspicion. Then we'll see what we can do about your mother's medical bills. Maybe there's some assistance program we can look into. Finian nodded, a spark of hope lighting up in his eyes. Thank you, Zeph. I don't know what I'd do without you. Zephyra forced a smile, but inside, she was in turmoil. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult. They would be walking a tightrope, trying to fix Finian's mistake without getting caught. Finn, she said, her voice serious, you have to promise me something. If things get bad again, if you feel trapped, you'll come and talk to me. No secrets, no desperate acts. Promise? Finian held her hand tightly. I promise, Zeph. I'll never hide anything from you again. They stood there, hands clasped together on the coffee table, the weight of the secret shared between them. Outside, the sun had risen fully, bathing the city in golden light. A new day had begun, bringing with it new challenges and, perhaps, new hopes. As they got up to leave, Zephyra couldn't help but think of Mr. Thorne, his piercing gaze and his zero-tolerance policy. She knew they were taking a huge risk. But looking at Finian, seeing the mixture of gratitude and determination in his eyes, she knew she had made the right choice. Let's face this together, she said, giving Finian's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. He nodded, a small smile curving his lips. Together, he repeated. And with that, they left the cafe, ready to face whatever the future held. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and tough decisions. But for the first time in a long time, neither Zephyra nor Finian felt alone. They had each other, and for now, that would have to be enough. Night fell over the city like a heavy cloak, bringing with it a stillness that contrasted sharply with Zephyra's inner turmoil. Sitting in her small apartment, she watched the city lights flicker through the window, each one representing a life, a story, a secret. The confrontation with Finian earlier that day still echoed in her mind. His words, laden with despair and shame, seemed to float in the air around her. Zephyra closed her eyes, letting the memories flood her thoughts. She remembered when she first met Finian years ago. They were both newcomers to the supermarket, young and full of hope. Finian, with his easy smile and silly jokes, quickly became her best friend. He was there when she lost her father, holding her hand at the funeral and helping her pick up the pieces of her shattered life. How did it come to this, Finn? Zephyra whispered to the empty room, her voice laced with emotion. The silence that responded was deafening. Zephyra stood up, walking into the small kitchen. Her fingers brushed against a photo on the fridge, her and Finian at the company's last Christmas, smiles wide and carefree. It seemed a lifetime ago. As she prepared a cup of tea, Zephyra couldn't help but think of Finian's mother, sick, in need of expensive treatment, and a son desperate to save her. Zephyra's heart squeezed. She understood the despair, the suffocating feeling of helplessness in the face of a loved one's illness. But stealing, she muttered, shaking her head. There were other ways, Finn. However, even as she spoke these words, Zephyra knew that it wasn't always so simple. Life had a cruel way of cornering people, forcing them to make impossible choices. Returning to the living room with her steaming cup, Zephyra settled down on the worn sofa. Her eyes landed on a pile of bills on the coffee table, rent overdue, electricity bill with a cutoff notice. She herself was not far removed from the desperation that had driven Finian to make his mistake. What would I have done in his place? The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Zephyra took a sip of tea, letting the heat of the drink warm her tense body. She knew she had promised to help Finian, but the reality of the situation was beginning to weigh heavily on her shoulders. How could they return the money without arousing suspicion? What if they were caught? Mr. Thorne's stern face appeared in her mind, his eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't known for his compassion. If he found out what Finian had done, there would be no mercy. Am I doing the right thing? Zephyra asked herself, doubt eating away at her resolve. Or am I just becoming an accomplice to a crime? The sound of a siren in the distance startled her. For a panicked moment, Zephyra imagined the police knocking on her door, accusing her of complicity. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. Paranoia wouldn't help anyone now. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of her cell phone. It was a message from Callista. "Hey, Zeph. You seemed strange today. If you need to talk, I'm here." Zephyra looked at the message, feeling a wave of guilt. Callista, always so attentive, so observant. For a moment, Zephyra considered telling her everything. Perhaps Callista could help, offer a different perspective. But then she remembered the promise she had made to Finian. No, she couldn't betray his trust. This was a burden she would have to carry alone, at least for the time being. "Thanks, Cal. Just tired. Nothing to worry about." She typed the reply, feeling the weight of the lie in every word. Putting her cell phone away, Zephyra stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the city continued its nightly dance, indifferent to the dramas unfolding behind closed doors and heavy hearts. She thought of all the people in the supermarket. Callista, struggling to pay the bills for the month. Mr. Thorne, with his obsession for rules and order. The customers who passed by his till every day, each carrying their own invisible battles. "We all have our secrets," Zephyra murmured, her breath slightly fogging the glass of the window. The night was drawing in, and Zephyra knew she should try to sleep. Tomorrow would be another day at the supermarket, another day pretending everything was normal, another day carrying the weight of Finian's secret. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Zephyra let her mind wander. She imagined herself confessing everything to Mr. Thorne, saw the shock and disappointment in his eyes. She saw Finian being taken away by the police, her mother sick and alone. She saw herself losing not only her job, but also the trust of everyone around her. Then she imagined another scenario. She saw Finian returning the money, little by little, without anyone noticing. She saw his mother getting better, thanks to the treatment he was able to pay for. She saw herself helping a friend get back on his feet, offering him a second chance. "What is the price of redemption?" Zephyra whispered into the darkness. The silence of the night offered no answers, only the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, reminding her that time continued to pass relentlessly. Zephyra closed her eyes, letting the tears she had been holding back all day finally fall. She cried for Finian, for her sick mother, for herself, and for the weight of the choice she had made. She cried for her lost innocence, for her shattered trust, for the friendship that now carried a shadow of doubt. But amid the tears, a resolution began to form. She would help Finian, not just for him, but for everything he represented. The desperate struggle against impossible circumstances, the search for redemption, the hope that even in the darkest moments there was still a chance to do the right thing. "We'll fix this, Finn," Zephyra murmured, feeling sleep finally approaching. Together. And so, with a plan that was still uncertain, but with renewed determination, Zephyra finally fell asleep. The next day would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make difficult choices. But for now, in her dreams, she found a moment of peace, a glimmer of hope for the uncertain future that awaited them. Outside, the city continued its nightly vigil, the lights twinkling like earthly stars, each telling its own story of struggle, redemption, and hope. And in her small apartment, Zephyra slept, unaware that her actions over the next few days would not only change her life, but would touch the lives of everyone around her in ways she could not yet imagine. The sun had barely risen when Zephyra arrived at the supermarket. The fresh morning air carried a promise of change, a sense that something important was about to happen. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Her eyes roamed the almost empty parking lot, landing on a familiar car. Finian was already there, waiting for her. Zephyra felt her heart racing. It was time to put her plan into action. "Good morning, Finn," she said softly, approaching her friend. Finian turned around, deep circles under his eyes marking his tired face. It was clear that he hadn't slept well either. "Hey, Zeph," he replied, trying to force a smile that didn't reach his eyes. For a moment they stood there, the silence between them laden with unspoken words and unfulfilled promises. Zephyra looked at her friend, really seeing him for the first time in a long time. She saw the weight he carried, the guilt that consumed him, the fear that kept him awake at night. "Finn," she began, her voice firm but gentle, "I've thought a lot about our situation, and I think I have an idea." Finian's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What idea?" Zephyra took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "What if we could turn this into something positive? Something that not only helps us, but helps all the employees?" Finian frowned, confused. "What are you talking about, Zeph?" "An employee support program," Zephyra explained, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "Something that offers financial help, counseling, maybe even medical assistance for cases like your mother's." Finian blinked, surprised. "But how would that help us return the money?" Zephyra smiled, a determined glint in her eyes. "Think about it, Finn. If we managed to implement a program like this, we could include an emergency fund. You could borrow from that fund to replace what you've taken from the till. It would be as if you had asked for help from the start." Understanding began to spread across Finian's face. "And no one would need to know about what I did?" "Exactly," Zephyra nodded. "But more than that, Finn. We could really make a difference. How many of our colleagues are going through similar difficulties to you? How many are one step away from doing something desperate?" Finian was silent for a moment, absorbing the idea. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with emotion. "Zeph, that's brilliant. But do you think Mr. Thorne would agree to something like that?" Zephyra hesitated. Mr. Thorne, with his rigid posture and piercing gaze, didn't seem like the kind of person open to innovative ideas. But she remembered something she had noticed, the brief glimmer of concern in his eyes when an employee looked overtired, the way he sometimes adjusted schedules to accommodate employees' needs. "I think it's worth a try," she finally said. "Worst case scenario, he says no. But what if he says yes? What if we can really make a difference?" A small smile began to form on Finian's lips, the first genuine smile Zephyra had seen in days. "Okay," he said, nodding slowly. "Let's do this. Where do we start?" Zephyra smiled, feeling a wave of relief and determination. "First, we need to make a list of all the things the program could offer. Then we'll research how other places have implemented similar programs. And then..." They spent the next hour sitting in Finian's car, discussing ideas, making notes, dreaming of the possibilities. As the sun rose in the sky, illuminating the parking lot, Zephyra felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. When they finally entered the supermarket, there was a new energy between them. Zephyra looked around, seeing her co-workers with new eyes. Callista, organizing the shelves, looked more tired than usual. Zephyra remembered that she had mentioned problems with the rent recently. Further along, she saw Jake, the new employee in the electronics department, nervously checking his cell phone. She wondered if he was also facing difficulties that he didn't dare share. "Look, Finn," she whispered, discreetly indicating her colleagues. "They could all benefit from what we're planning." Finian nodded, his eyes filling with determination. "Let's make this happen, Zeph. Not just for me, but for all of them." The working day passed in a blur of activity. Zephyra and Finian used every free moment to refine their ideas, research similar programs in other companies on their phones, and discuss how they would approach Mr. Thorne. During her break, Zephyra met Callista in the staff room. Her friend looked worried, her hands shaking slightly as she held her coffee cup. "Cal, is everything all right?" Zephyra asked softly. Callista hesitated, biting her lip. "It's just, the rent has gone up again. I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet this month." Zephyra felt her heart squeeze. This was exactly why they needed this program. "Cal, what if there was a way to get help? An employee support program, perhaps?" Callista's eyes widened. That would be amazing, Zeph. But do you think Mr. Thorne would agree to something like that?" "There's only one way to find out," Zephyra replied, a determined smile on her face. When the working day was finally over, Zephyra and Finian met again in the parking lot. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, as if the universe itself was celebrating their determination. "Are we ready for this?" Finian asked, a touch of nervousness in his voice. Zephyra looked at the notes they had made, at the draft proposal they had drawn up. It was more than just a plan to fix Finian's mistake. It was a chance to do something truly meaningful. "We are," she replied, her voice firm. "Tomorrow, we'll talk to Mr. Thorne." As they said goodbye, Zephyra felt a mixture of anxiety and hope bubble up in her chest. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Convincing Mr. Thorne, implementing the program, making sure Finian could return the money without arousing suspicion, all of this would be a challenge. But looking at Finian, seeing the gratitude and determination in his eyes, Zephyra knew it would be worth it. They weren't just fixing a mistake. They were creating something that could change lives. As they drove home, Zephyra couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, she was looking forward to seeing what the future held. The sun finally set, plunging the city into darkness. But for Zephyra, there had never been so much light. She fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, dreaming of a future where no one would have to face their battles alone. Mr. Thorne's office had always seemed like a minefield to Zephyra, but this morning, it was as if every step took her closer to an inevitable explosion. The walls, decorated with performance charts and certificates of excellence, seemed to watch her with critical eyes, judging her every move. Zephyra clutched the folders to her chest, feeling the weight of the hopes and dreams they contained. Next to her, Finian was the embodiment of nervousness. His fingers danced a frantic waltz against her thigh, a rhythm that echoed the turmoil in her heart. Zephyra reached out and gently touched her friend's arm. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment they shared an ocean of emotions: fear, hope, determination. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, the words laden with a conviction she wasn't sure she really felt. The sound of the door opening startled them both. Mr. Thorne emerged, his presence filling the space like an impending storm. His eyes, always sharp as blades, scanned Zephyra and Finian, one eyebrow arched in a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Miss Zephyra, Mr. Finian," he greeted, his voice as controlled as a conductor conducting an orchestra. "To what do I owe this very unexpected visit?" Zephyra took a step forward, feeling as if she were on the edge of a precipice. "Mr. Thorne, we have a proposal we'd like to present. It's about the future of our supermarket and everyone who is part of it." Mr. Thorne studied them for a moment, his face a mask of neutrality that not even the most skilled poker player could decipher. Finally, he nodded, gesturing for them to enter. "Very well. Let's hear this very important proposal." The office seemed to shrink at the presence of the three of them. Zephyra and Finian sat down, the leather of the chairs creaking under the weight of their anxieties. Mr. Thorne took his place behind the desk, a mahogany fortress separating them. "So," Mr. Thorne began, interlacing his fingers on the table like a judge about to give his verdict, What is this proposal about?" Zephyra took a deep breath, feeling the air heavy with unspoken expectations. "Mr. Thorne, recently, Finian and I have been observing. Well, we've noticed that many of our colleagues are facing silent battles. Financial difficulties that keep them awake at night, health problems that consume not only their bodies but their souls, stress that eats away at their lives like acid." She paused, her eyes fixed on Mr. Thorne, searching for any sign of empathy in that face carved from stone. For a moment, she saw something, a glimmer of, was it understanding? "Go on," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. Encouraged, Zephyra continued, her voice gaining strength. "We thought that maybe we could create an employee support program, something that offered more than just a salary, but a safety net. Financial help when the world seems to be falling apart. A helping hand when the weight becomes unbearable. Medical assistance when the body betrays the will to go on." Finian, finding his voice buried under layers of fear, added, "We believe that a program like this would not only help the employees, but would uplift the entire supermarket. After all, a light heart moves mountains that tired hands can't." Mr. Thorne remained silent, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him like an explorer mapping unknown territory. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of experience. "That's an audacious proposal, but also potentially expensive. How do you suggest we finance this dream?" Zephyra felt her heart racing, a marathon in her chest. "Well, we've thought of a few options," she began, opening one of the folders with hands that trembled slightly. "We could redirect a small percentage of the profits as seeds planted for a more prosperous future. Perhaps seek partnerships with local institutions, create a support network that extends beyond our walls." As Zephyra explained the financial details, she watched Mr. Thorne intently. His face remained a mask of neutrality, but there was something in his eyes, a spark of interest, perhaps even admiration. "You've clearly put time and heart into this," Mr. Thorne commented when Zephyra had finished. "But tell me, what led you down this path? Why is it so vital to you?" Zephyra and Finian exchanged glances, a silent dialogue passing between them. Finian, mustering all the courage he possessed, began to speak, his voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. "Mr. Thorne, my mother is ill," he said, each word laden with pain and love. "The treatment is expensive, a monster that devours not only our resources, but our hope. I've struggled day after day to keep my head above water, and I know I'm not the only one here swimming against the current. If we had a program like this, maybe no one would have to feel as alone as I did." The silence that followed was so thick, it could have been cut with a knife. Zephyra watched Mr. Thorne, her heart beating so hard that she feared everyone could hear it. For a moment she saw something, a shadow of emotion, perhaps even understanding, flash across the manager's face. "I see," Mr. Thorne finally said, his voice surprisingly soft. "And you, Miss Zephyra, what is your motivation on this journey?" Zephyra felt the weight of all the expectations on her. This was the moment of truth, of opening her heart and hoping it would be enough. "Mr. Thorne, I saw a friend sink into a sea of despair. I saw how it affected not only him, but the entire ecosystem around us. And I realized that we could be more than just co-workers. We could be a family, a safe haven in the midst of the storm." She paused, gathering her courage for her next words. "I believe that a business is more than numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about people, about lives woven into a complex tapestry. And if we can strengthen every thread of that tapestry, the end result will be more beautiful and resilient than we could ever have imagined." Mr. Thorne studied them for a long moment, his face a blank canvas waiting to be painted. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, a small smile forming on his lips, like the sun rising after a long night. "You two surprised me today," he said, his words carrying a weight that Zephyra hadn't expected. "Not just with this proposal, but with the depth of your compassion and vision. Inspiring." Zephyra felt a wave of hope rise in her chest, a tide that threatened to overflow. "So, will you consider the proposal?" Mr. Thorne nodded slowly, each movement charged with meaning. "I'm going to do more than consider it. I'm going to form a committee to study the feasibility and implementation details. You two, of course, will be an integral part of that committee." The wave of relief and joy that swept through the room was almost palpable, a tsunami of emotions that threatened to break down all barriers. Zephyra and Finian exchanged glances of surprise and gratitude, unnecessary words in that moment of pure connection. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne," Finian said, his voice tinged with emotion. "That means more than words can express, Mr. E." Thorne stood up, a gesture that signaled the end of the meeting, but the beginning of something much bigger. "Don't thank me yet. We have a mountain to climb, but I'm proud of you both. That's what I look for in my employees. Not just dedication, but vision and heart." As they left the office, Zephyra felt as if she had left a huge weight behind, replaced by wings that lifted her up. She looked at Finian, seeing in him a reflection of her own hope and determination. "We did it, Finn," she whispered, the words laden with promise. Finian nodded, tears shining in his eyes like diamonds. "Thank you, Zeph, for everything." As they walked back to their posts, Zephyra couldn't help but notice how different the supermarket looked. The lights seemed brighter, the air lighter, as if the building itself was breathing with new life. She looked around, seeing her colleagues with new eyes. Callista, Jake, all the familiar faces that passed her by every day. Faces that could soon shine with renewed hope. Zephyra smiled, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the lightness of possibility. They had planted a seed of change, and now it was up to them to nurture it, water it with dedication and care, and see what would blossom. And as she returned to her box, ready to face another day, Zephyra knew that something fundamental had changed, not just for her and Finian, but for everyone there. They had opened a door, and through it, glimpsed a future where no one would have to face their battles alone. The working day began, but for Zephyra, it was more than just another shift. It was the first day of the rest of their lives, the start of a journey that promised to transform not just the supermarket, but every life it touched. And so, with a heart full of hope and determination, Zephyra faced the day, knowing that every interaction, every smile, every moment was an opportunity to build the future they had imagined. A future where compassion and understanding were as essential as the products on the shelves. A future that, thanks to them, was now within reach. The supermarket buzzed with electric energy that morning. It was as if the air was charged with possibilities, each breath a reminder that something monumental was about to happen. Zephyra felt it in every fiber of her being as she walked through the aisles, her heart a battery of hope and apprehension. The eyes of her colleagues followed her, some curious, others anxious. The buzz about the employee support program had spread like fire through dry straw, igniting sparks of hope in hearts that had long been resigned. Finian was at his till, his fingers dancing over the keys with an almost palpable urgency. Zephyra could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of weeks of secrets and guilt still visible on his tired face. "Hey, Finn," she called softly, stepping closer. "How are you feeling?" He looked up, a fragile smile playing on his lips. "Like I'm about to jump out of an airplane without a parachute," he replied, his voice shaky. What if it goes wrong, Zeph? What if... Zephyra placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, feeling the muscles tense under her fingers. It'll work out, Finn. We have to believe that. But even as the words left his lips, Zephyra felt a twinge of doubt. The committee had worked tirelessly over the last few weeks, refining the proposal, calculating figures, planning every detail. Today was the day they would present the finished program to Mr. Thorne. Today was the day they would know whether their dreams would come true or crumble like a sandcastle. The sound of firm footsteps echoed down the corridor, and all eyes turned to see Mr. Thorne emerging from his office. His face was a mask of neutrality, but there was a tension in his posture that made Zephyra's stomach churn. "Miss Zephyra, Mr. Finian," he called, his voice cutting through the buzz of the supermarket like a knife. "In my office, please." Zephyra and Finian exchanged nervous glances before following Mr. Thorne. The office, which had once resembled a battlefield, now looked more like an execution chamber. Mr. Thorne sat behind his desk, his eyes scanning the anxious faces in front of him. "Well," he began, his voice carrying a weight that Zephyra couldn't decipher, "the committee has concluded its analysis of the proposed program." The silence that followed was deafening. Zephyra could hear her own heart beating furiously against her ribs, a symphony of fear and hope. Finian finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Thorne studied them for a long moment before continuing. "The program is ambitious, perhaps even revolutionary for an operation of our size." Zephyra felt her heart sink. She knew that tone. It was the prelude to a polite rejection. But then something unexpected happened. A small but genuine smile curved Mr. Thorne's lips. "That's exactly the kind of innovation we need." The wave of relief and joy that swept through the room was almost palpable. Zephyra felt tears burning in her eyes, while Finian let out a broken sob. "You two," Mr. Thorne continued, his voice softer than they had ever heard it, "have shown extraordinary vision and compassion. This program will not only help our employees, it will elevate our entire business. I'm proud of you." The words hung in the air, charged with emotion and promise, but before Zephyra or Finian could respond, a sudden noise startled them. The office door opened abruptly, and Callista rushed in, her eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Thorne! Zephyra! It's Finian! He's—" But her words were interrupted by the sight of Finian sitting there, pale and trembling. Callista stopped, confused. "But I just saw you at the checkout trying to—" The realization struck Zephyra like a bolt of lightning. She turned to Finian, seeing the horror spread across his face. "Finn," she whispered, "what have you done?" Finian stood up abruptly, his legs shaking. I just wanted to make things right before it was too late." Mr. Thorne stood up, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What are you talking about?" Time seemed to freeze. Zephyra could feel the weight of the moment, the fragility of everything they had fought for. She looked at Finian, seeing the desperation in his eyes, and made a decision. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice trembling, "there's something we need to tell you." And so, there in that office, with Callista as a silent witness, Zephyra and Finian unveiled the whole truth. The initial theft, the plan to return the money, the birth of the idea for the support program. Every word was a confession and a plea, a hope that the truth, however painful, could be the path to redemption. Mr. Thorne listened to everything in silence, his face an impenetrable mask. When they finished, the silence that followed was heavy, fraught with possibilities and consequences. Finally, Mr. Thorne spoke, his voice calm but firm. "What you have done is serious. Under normal circumstances, it would result in immediate dismissal and possible legal action." Zephyra felt her heart break. Everything they had fought for, all their hopes and dreams, seemed to melt before their eyes. But then, Mr. Thorne continued, his voice softening. However, what you did afterwards, the way you turned a mistake into an opportunity to help not only yourselves, but everyone around you, it shows a character and integrity that I can't ignore. He stood up and walked over to the window overlooking the supermarket. Outside, employees and customers went about their routines, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside. The program will be implemented, Mr. Thorne announced, turning to face them. And you two will be in charge of it. I consider this not only a second chance, but an opportunity to turn this mistake into something truly meaningful. The tears Zephyrah had been holding back finally overflowed. Next to her, Finian sobbed openly, years of tension and fear dissolving into pure relief. Thank you, Finian managed to say between sobs. I promise, I won't let you down, any of you. Mr. Thorne nodded, a small smile on his lips. I know you won't. Now let's announce the good news to everyone. When they left the office, the entire supermarket seemed to have stopped. Curious and anxious eyes followed them as Mr. Thorne climbed onto a small makeshift platform. Attention, everyone, he began, his voice echoing through the space. I have an important announcement to make. And so, in front of a stunned audience, Mr. Thorne unveiled the new employee support program. Every word was greeted with gasps of surprise and murmurs of hope. Zephyrah watched the faces around her, seeing smiles forming, tears of relief being shed. When Mr. Thorne finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before a wave of applause and shouts of joy erupted. It was as if a dam of pent-up emotions had finally broken. In the middle of the celebration, Zephyrah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Callista, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You did it, she whispered. You really did it. Zephyrah smiled, pulling Callista and Finian into a tight embrace. There, in the midst of the chaos of joy and hope, she felt something click in her chest. They had faced the worst and emerged stronger, more united. As the day progressed, turning into an impromptu celebration, Zephyrah couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them there. A mistake, born of desperation, had turned into something beautiful and transformative. She looked around at the smiling faces of her colleagues, at Finian, who seemed to have lifted years of weight from his shoulders, at Mr. Thorne, who was watching everything with a look of paternal pride. This wasn't the end, Zephyrah knew. It was only the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome. But now they would face it all together, as a family united by something greater than themselves. And as the sun set, casting golden rays through the supermarket windows, Zephyrah felt a peace she hadn't experienced for a long time. They had turned a workplace into a home, a group of strangers into a community. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing a mistake or implementing a program. It was about rediscovering humanity amid the chaos of everyday life. It was about hope, redemption, and the transformative power of compassion. And there, in that moment of celebration and togetherness, Zephyrah knew that no matter what the future held, they would be ready. Together, they could face any storm, overcome any obstacle, because now they had something more precious than any program or policy. They had each other. The supermarket, once just a place of work, now pulsed with a new energy. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to what can happen when people unite for the greater good. And at the center of it all were Zephyrah and Finian, two friends who dared to dream and, in the process, changed not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. As night fell and the celebrations continued, Zephyrah gazed at the starry sky through the window. She made a silent promise to herself and to everyone there. This was just the beginning. The best was yet to come. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.